Welcome to the Gamut of Performance Podcast, episode 33. On this episode of the podcast, I get to talk with Dr. John Cohn. Dr. Cohn has effectively branded himself as one of the premier superpowers in working with soccer players. Dr. Cohn is the founder of Fit for 90. He has worked extensively with Major League Soccer, high-level college soccer, as well as all levels in between. This conversation is really necessary in the field of physical preparation, so without further ado, here is Dr. John Cohn. John, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy man, so it means a lot that you take the time out of your day to hop on here and share some knowledge. So for the listeners at home, will you tell us a little bit about your background, your motivation, and where you are currently?
Yeah, it's an interesting, you look at your background, not trying to give you a summary of my resume, but really the catalyst for me in entering and doing what I do is I was injured as an athlete, and finishing a college career and trying to play professional and kind of moving in and out of a rehabilitation setting to get healthy and then being healthy and being injured again. It really was a catalyst for me to pursue an education in sports science because I didn't have one as an undergrad. And then just throughout my career, I was really fortunate to be lucky enough where universities would pay for my education. Yeah. And I think, obviously, from a money perspective, a financial perspective, that's unbelievable. Yeah. But more so, I look back on it, it was really the experience of walking from a classroom or laboratory setting onto a field, and always moving back and forth between those two environments that really, I think, is the single biggest thing I bring to the table in terms of my ability to connect the dots in terms of the science and the research settings to the practical, the field-based setting, and that's the biggest thing. I think I still identify myself very much as a coach, although I have a strong background in research and so forth. I still very much identify myself as a coach, and I think it's the one thing I'd say is I've worn a lot of different hats because of this. That really helps. And I feel like that is my single biggest, piece to the puzzle of my background that I would say is really unique.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Will you elaborate a little bit on your time at UNC and UT?
Yeah, it was an interesting time for me because I was at Tennessee. I was an assistant coach for the women's team. It was great. It was a great situation for me. Again, it paid for my master's degree while I was there, and then the opportunity came to come to UNC and work with the men's team. And for me, one of my goals, and I reflect back on that time, and I remember sitting down with Elmar, the head coach at UNC, and really sat down and said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, in 2 to 3 years, I'd like to be in the MLS as a goalkeeping and fitness coach." At this point in time, there was no fitness. It wasn't even a thought process for anyone. And I had a master's degree in physiology and exercise physiology at the time, and was at the same time pursuing other educational pathways abroad in England and stuff. The Fitness Trainers Award, which had just been launched, and it really. That was my objective. Coming into UNC was to get back into men's soccer because that was the avenue that would allow me to get into the professional environment. And surprisingly, how you lay things out, and you kind of plan things in your head. And even I went to as far as writing out a 3 to 5 and a 10-year plan of what I wanted to do.
You know what they say, right? Life is what happens when you're busy planning.
It was, I remember specifically sitting down at the end of year 2 with Elmar, and I was like, he's, what do you think? I said, I want to be here another year. I think one more year, I'll be really fully prepared to step into the MLS, the professional environment, and do what I want to do in terms of both the goalkeeping and the integration of sports science. I think another year at the college level really helped me out. That great experience, being at UNC, and it led me into the MLS.
Awesome. And so that's the perfect segue, right? So will you touch a little bit on your time at Sporting Kansas City, Portland Timbers, and U.S. Soccer Federation?
Yeah, it's been kind of a unique, kind of an interesting pathway since since I went to Kansas City. I came in as primarily, basically an assistant coach, and over the 2 years there, really goalkeeping coach, but then also fitness coach, kind of wearing 2 hats. And I found it was just you can't be in 2 places at once. That was the biggest thing, for me while I was trying to do 2 things. When you should be warming up the team, you're training the goalkeepers, and you're kind of looking at the other coach when he's warming up the team, and kind of seeing how he's doing and stuff like that. And so in the end, I really decided at the end of halfway through my second year, it was like I started to look at PhD programs and decided I really wanted to be a specialist in sports science, and I wanted to to go that pathway. And it's interesting because a lot of friends at the time, you bounce ideas off your friends,
Yeah.
What do you think, and so forth. And a lot of them go, what are you thinking? You're in MLS, you're 34 years old, you're an assistant coach in the league, which is pretty young, And I looked at it and I said, for me, I was really passionate, obviously, about the science. For me, I really found myself, wanting to take care of the players, that being an advocate for the players to an extent.
Yeah.
And obviously, when you think about it in those terms, you're going to be better in terms of the role I'm in now, as opposed to a coach, especially at the professional level, where it's more about moving players in and out of the locker room.
Yeah.
And the science was really my passion. So I was fortunate. Came back to North Carolina, did my PhD down the road at Greensboro. Studied, all along I knew I was going to do something really specific to soccer.
Yeah.
Is it going to be an intervention or something else? And I ended up doing basically a match simulation. I individualized it through the intermittent recovery test.
Okay.
And then looked at soccer specific fatigue and how it affected lower extremity biomechanics. Finishing that off, I think doing that was, I think, for me, I looked at it all along as being, for me, this is the qualifications necessary.
Yeah.
This is not the qualifications, it's a poor way to say it, but the education necessary for me to really think about things holistically. And that really was what the catalyst was for me, going back into the MLS with the Timbers as director of sports science. I really had this vision of what a department would look like, and looked forward to trying to implement it. And then obviously things you move on into other avenues. In the U.S. soccer, I think it's been a great opportunity for me to continue to educate a large number of coaches. And that's probably everybody messes being in a team. You spend your whole time in the team environment. Genuinely miss that, but then also week to week going into teaching the coaching courses and being able to pass on an education, my experiences and my education to the coaches. I really think that's it's a great way to improve the game.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And then on that sports science segue, will you just jump in a little bit to how you started to develop Fit for 90?
Yeah, out of the same need, really. Actually, in 2005, when I was in Kansas City, I had University of Washington, so your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
The coach there approached me and said, "What do you think about planning my season for me?" Essentially, periodize the soccer-specific aspects of the season and so forth. So, I agreed to do it for almost no money. And I look back and I'm like, oh my God, I must have penny an hour. But it really was kind of the catalyst for me. One, there's probably a little bit of a market for this because it's an interesting gap where the coaches don't quite understand it. When we want to integrate it in a really soccer-specific way and take a games-based approach and really implement it through our training environment, it's more difficult than you have to have a little bit of a soccer-specific background, essentially. So it's a little bit of a niche. And so that really, the consulting bit that I did, in essence, for about 8 years, I'd manage a couple teams every year. Because it was so time consuming, because it was all essentially paper based and a lot of planning, and that really was a catalyst for Fit for 90. And then, started off software development, so we could basically grow it, and it wouldn't take as long for me to deliver the actual information and deliver it in a little bit better way, and then that led to us developing out the athlete monitoring system that we have now.
No, that's really cool. Okay. Will you and then you touched on a point, so will you kind of just explain that periodization and what that looked like, for example, for that soccer team for University of Washington or for a general team?
Yeah, so essentially, the thought process is, of course, that the players walk in every day, they wake up, and you and I wake up, we have a finite amount of energy, right? Now, most of the time, the fitness aspect is an afterthought, right? It's kind of something that the coaches tack on at the end. I look back on my own career, and it was like, all right, we're going to go to the track today at the end of training, or we're going to go, we're running 400, we're going to run the 2 mile, and all these things. In essence, that's energy wasted. It could be energy wasted more holistically speaking on basically, the player actions on the field, right? And so kind of taking the perception action coupling kind of approach, like, we always want to be integrating decision making. We want to always be integrating the ball as much as possible. So the idea is to give the coach the framework of their training day. So essentially, I would say there's 3 things that we do for the coach in terms of framework, in terms of the periodization. One's what's the load? How big is the day, so to speak? And giving them specific targets in terms of the readiness coming in. So essentially, being able to we expect something from the team, but can we identify through the monitoring system an individuals that are outside of the window? Right, so what's the readiness of the team? That in turn should be linked to the training load. Where's that load coming from? So some days it's just from tactical work, and so the kind of the physical underpinnings of the exercises the coach does. And obviously the coach we have to educate the coach to make sure that they can plan those exercises effectively. And then obviously there's days where there is a fitness component, there is a physical development piece. And then when we do that, that's really through a games-based approach, playing different size games. Is it small-sided, 3v3, 4v4, moderate size, 5v5, 7v7, where, for instance, developing out more of an aerobic power-based size game. And then obviously 8v8, 11v11 are biggest or most extensive size games that are really driving, the aerobic capacity development of the players to be able to deal with the 90 minutes of fatigue, right? Final layer, the third layer, is obviously progressing the session. So if you start with the warm-up, because obviously the warm-up needs to be different relative to what the players did in previous days. Then also, if it's a high-load day and we do a lot of intensive work leading in that final phase where we want to play games for fitness, players aren't going to have the legs to do it. So how can we manage the players, kind of the ebb and the flow of the players through the session to make sure that we get the volume, overall volume we want in terms of workload, but then also from a coaching perspective, the coach has the ability to get the number of high quality actions that really drive player development. And so that's I know that's a long elevator. But in essence, that's kind of that's really what we do on the periodization side for the teams. And then obviously I alluded to the monitoring piece, where of course we're tracking readiness, site soreness, hydration, and then also subjective rating perceived exertion, so session rating perceived exertion from the players to track training load.
No, awesome. And kind of with that, right? So we touched on it a little bit in our previous conversation, but what does like testing procedures and standards look like? And then what about when if you have a player that can't necessarily reach those testing procedures and standards, but they may say be quote unquote game fit?
So there's multiple elements to the testing. Obviously, in a team environment where we talk about the small-sided, mid-size, and big-size games, there's what I would call subjective testing, right? And essentially now what we're doing is structuring, and this is obviously one of the challenges is we're in a decision-making environment. And in turn, there's a lot of variability, right? Because ultimately the ball's going to roll different every day. Right? But we want to control, in that environment, we want to control as many of those variables as we can. So I say, we want the ball always has to be in play. So for instance, if we're playing 12 minutes of 11, the ball has to be in play for the 12 minutes, right? So there's no stoppages, anything that slows the game down, we want to get rid of it. And then obviously we want to push the players to play as fast as they can. Right? So in that way, we're controlling as many variables as we can because we can't control their decision making. And so in the end, we end up with this subjective benchmark, right, of essentially what how fit the team is overall. Right, and so this is a team-based measurement, right? And this is probably the best way on the field to quantify the team. And then that piece really drives the periodization for the team after that. Now, going into the individual testing, right, and actually now having an objective measure is really important. And I wrote an article about this quite a while ago. When I was doing my PhD actually at UNCG, and I think it was a unique or a different lens at performance testing, because ultimately, looking at my time there and in that environment, I'm the only performance guy in a group of athletic trainers and physical therapists. And so what I found myself doing was how can we more effectively bridge the gap with our performance testing so we can simultaneously quantify return to play. And so it came up with a battery. Obviously, from a fitness perspective, we went with the intermittent recovery test because it's obviously one of the most well-researched.
I agree.
Well-researched tests out there. So that's the fitness test essentially. And then when we started to look, and I've changed these over time, kind of adapt them a little bit to my own experience. We wanted to essentially a strength test. Right? And so, what probably makes the most sense, because everything has to be unilateral, because we need to be able to ultimately have a unilateral test. So star excursion, balance test made the most sense. So what essentially is morphed into the Y balance. But obviously both work. They're both essentially the same test, just one's performed one's a tape on the floor measure, one's another, one's you buy a little bit of equipment to do. Right? And then obviously as a player comes back from injury, the first things, developing that strength in a controlled way, and then moving on to concentric power. So now what we had was a single leg squat jump, right? So essentially the player squatting down on a single leg, controlling the angle at the knee, and then jumping as far as they can to land on 2 feet, or even if depending on the injury, land on the opposite foot so we're not eccentrically loading the injured limb at all. So kind of adapting it to the environment of the injury is an important piece. So obviously the concentric power, and then going into a plyometric power test. So triple hop.
Yeah. Okay.
What I found kind of fits in the gap between those tests is I'll do just a counter movement, single leg jump.
Okay.
Again, landing on 2 feet. So kind of getting now your concentric power, a little bit of introduction of the plyometric power, and then really a true stretch shortening cycle action.
Okay.
And then also a 505 agility test for a cutting action.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of the individual testing batteries. And obviously, coming in, it gives us a little bit of a clearer view of the neuromechanical profile of the player. It also tells a little bit about the asymmetries that a player may have, and how these. It's really interesting when you start to look at it, because we'll see asymmetries that are different in terms of strength and concentric versus plyometric power. You're looking at like, that's just funky.
Yeah.
Why is the guys great on the strength, or we even see it flipped. Where we had one player, for instance, we did the triple hop. It was somewhere between 8 and 12% on everything except for the triple hop, and then it was flipped, and he was at 14% on the triple hop in terms of the non-dominant limb leading. And so immediately, athletic training, we go talk to the player, and he had a fifth met about a year and a little bit before, and he's like, it just, when I push off of it, it's really tender. It's like I just couldn't do it. And so now, it's not something the player would. You would hope the player would have said something eventually.
Right. Yeah.
But obviously now, getting that from the test, you kind of, it's given us the idea is to glean a little bit more information. We're getting information that the eyes, we usually recognize, this guy's more agile than this guy's faster, and so forth. But can we do testing that really allows us to make future decisions, but then recognizes things that we don't, that we may not see automatically?
No, that definitely makes sense. So in terms of like the agility component, right? So, or the speed conditioning, what happens when you have a standard, right? Say you have a team standard, and then there's an outlier that can't necessarily meet that standard just for that test, but say in practice, that kind of thing, they seem up to par.
Yeah, it's a matter of, I think it's, one, if players, for instance, especially in soccer, where you have a player that maybe is not as fit, but they're really intelligent, they make the right decisions, and they sit in the right spots and stuff like that. So that they're able to hide a little bit in training. The question always is, like, for instance, when we take the intermittent recovery score, taking a mean and just a simple standard deviation approach, look at our outliers. Right? Because ultimately, if I'm a big outlier, if I'm at 1.5 standard deviations below the mean for the team, and I'm training with that team, we have to think that player is going to be an increased risk. Over the course of the season, eventually they're going to start to break down because they're playing in an environment that physically is outpacing what their capacity is.
That makes sense.
So that's where, can we recognize it and then come up with an individual kind of prescription, an individual development plan for that player? So obviously, we want him still to train with the team. We want him to train with the team as much as we can. But there's going to be moments where, like on a hard fitness day, maybe you need to reduce the load for them. So, for instance, the theory is, of course, and this is really the implementation of it. Say we, it's a 5v5, 77 day, and we're doing repeated sprinting at the beginning. Well, the thing that has the least soccer meaning is repeated sprinting, and that's going to be the highest physical load. So, for that player, for instance, it's really still important for them to experience the stimulus. So we don't want to remove the stimulus entirely, but let's go ahead and have them do, say, 50% of the reps that the team's doing. They still experience it, but now we backed them off. And then they could maybe, and it obviously depends on the individual and how far outside they were, but now they can play all the games in the 5v5, the 6v6, whatever it is for whatever we have for numbers-wise for the day. So that's really the thought process. If you periodize it, what I found is when we periodize it systematically for the team, even on a day where a player didn't sleep while they had an exam and so forth, and this is the prescription, it's really easy to say, you know what, that last game of 5v5, we're just going to back you off a little bit, rest, or even the player we talk about that's outside the mark. Can we supplement him in some way? And so now it's that spectrum, of reducing mechanical load. Maybe it is a bicycle. Because we're going to recover quicker from the bike. And so now the overuse potential for that player to introduce an injury down the road is less.
That makes sense.
While we're still giving them physiological stimulus to kind of help them catch up as much as we can.
That makes sense. Do you think it's, so kind of a branch off of this, right? Do you think it's arbitrary to say have a certain level for, say, the Yoyo Test that all players have to reach? Or do you think that's, that's kind of generally how most teams do it, I feel like. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think as a starting point, what I usually tell our teams is, as a starting point, let's base it off of either the data set that I have, which is growing pretty extensively at the college level and so forth. So we can benchmark that. If we don't have that, we could go off the literature, right? So what's normal for that team, and then for that level, I should say, and then let's make it position specific,
okay,
right? And so in the very first time we test the team, let's do it this way. And then we're going to test them again. Yeah. And so now as we test them repeatedly, what we'll start to see is individual trends. And so for me, after I get about 3 data points on an individual, which we normally get, not so much in the fall season, because the fall season is just it's insane. Right? But in the spring, we can get these 3 data points. Right? So when we do it across the spring, now we have kind of a little bit of a path, a trajectory of the player. We can see the ebb and the flow relative to what we've been doing in terms of the different windows of time. And so now when they come in the next preseason, everything's individualized. Right? So for instance, it's a conversation with the coach. For me, I look at the data and I usually make some notes in terms of what I think is how far can we kind of push. But I can't make this decision without understanding kind of the dynamics of the player and how they play. And so now it's a soccer conversation about how do they play the game? What's your role in your style of play? How do you need him to play? And so then it'll be like, you know what? I think we can push this guy up a whole nother level because really his diet's not good. He doesn't sleep well. And I'm like, use it as a catalyst to like push the player. Manage yourself better in the off season, because if you don't do these things, one, you're never going to hit the benchmark we're setting for you, and you're not going to achieve what we need you to achieve on the field. And so kind of using it in that way to really hone in on the individual. I think that's, in my experience, I think it's another way, another pathway to lead the player. And obviously, players that really they're athletes for 2 hours when they're out with us. Then after that, they forget they're an athlete. They don't sleep. They don't do any of these things well. And so the idea is to create kind of a
24-hour athlete.
Exactly.
No, I like that.
And so I think that data can help us drive the players in that direction through educating them. And so it's a longer way to get there. Obviously, it takes a little bit more work. That's one thing I always say to my business partner. We don't do much that makes life easier for people. That's always a software thing. Right? Like software's meant to make things easier. I'm like, we don't make things easier. Like you want to make things better. That takes work.
No, most definitely. I agree.
So I think that's for me what we kind of the pathway in terms of that score.
No, that makes sense, right? And you touched on the fall season and how crazy it is, especially at university level, right? So let's talk about how do we increase compliance as far as like preseason training? Because a lot of universities say mid-majors, right? They're not necessarily required to be there in the summer, and so not everyone is training at the level they should be. So how do we take this?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, the way in the past, the way we did it was, obviously paper-based programs, which is pretty normal. And what I found, quite a while ago, I did a youth national team camp, and we sent them away with a training packet. And basically, I had them fill out the readiness on a day-to-day basis, and each week they'd put in the score, and then they'd basically go to a box and simple matrix and say, okay, well, each day, now here's my fitness, and so essentially trying to account for what their environment was. Right. And so what we did, off of that, I was like, this will work really well for the summer training packet, so to speak. So we actually deliver our summer training packets to the teams we work with through software. And so the players, we try to think of the easiest way to explain this, because picture's worth 1,000 words. But essentially, you think about a player on the first day. The first day to log in the system, we need to have a little bit of information, right? So we need bare minimum. Like, and this again, is like if we ask too many questions, the player walks away. Right? So we need the readiness for the day, and then we need to know at least what you're doing the next 3 days. So for instance, I walk in on day 1 and I report my fatigue, mood, stress, sleep quality and sleep quantity, specific site soreness, hydration, and so forth. And then what are you doing today? Right? So for instance, a player walks in today and they say, well, readiness is at 85. Our training session today, I don't have training the next day, but I have a game on the 3rd day. Okay, well, now knowing that you have a game on the 3rd day, that caps what we're capable of doing today. Right? So your readiness today, you have your training session today. After you do the training session, can you report your training load? So essentially your session RPE. So now we know how hard today was. Knowing you have a game on the 3rd day, to log in the 2nd day, we know what happened yesterday. Report their readiness again. They can update the schedule if needed. they have the game tomorrow, and then they report the fourth day. So after the first day, where they report 3 days, they just report each additional day.
Yeah.
And then what we end up with is kind of this scrolling window where we know your readiness, we know your schedule, we know your training loads that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Now we can really kind of hone in on the individual needs. So for instance, if the player's coming up and it's training today and they don't have anything for the next 2 days, that training session was, say a 5 for 60 minutes, we're going to do a fitness session. So we'll supplement them to get them to an 8 or a 9.
Okay.
Right, through the prescription that we have based off of where they came in fitness-wise and entering the packet. So the idea is, some players are going to be overtraining, some players are going to be undertraining. How do we push them towards the sweet spot to basically prolong our preseason?
Yeah. No, I like that.
It's a pretty dynamic way.
Yeah.
I've explained it quite a bit, so hopefully that's. I know it wasn't succinct, but it's tough to make that succinct because it's really dynamic. I mean, it's completely, it's a completely fluid approach to the player's needs. Really individualized approach.
No, most definitely. Okay, so what happens when, say, you take that approach, but a player isn't as responsible to do that work on the preseason, right? So they show up day one, not necessarily at the level they should be, but now we have to scale stuff down. But at the same time, we can't scale it down because it's season. So how do we take that?
Well, it goes back to 2 layers of one. In terms of what we try to do to contribute to compliance. The players can set, within the app-based system, they set text reminders. Within the iOS, the Apple-based system, now they're setting, in-app reminders. So there's really no excuse for the player not to do it, other than them absolutely not caring. And then obviously we have to educate them. Educate them in terms of, what's the risk if you don't do the work, in terms of injury when you come in terms of not being able to play. That's where, of course, the compliance of having that intermittent recovery score that we talked about earlier hopefully increases the likelihood that the player's going to do it. And then in the end, if the player comes in and you have that anomaly, comes in and that player we talked about a little bit ago that's at 1.5 standard deviations away from the team, now we have to manage you as an individual. Right? Okay. And so there's multiple layers to it where, of course, now, if we try and catch them up, we're likely putting them on a trajectory that's going to be an injury trajectory because we're trying to push too much upon them. Like the body can't adapt quickly enough. And so now, more than likely, we're backing off. So hopefully we can educate the players, and then when that does happen, we're fitting them into the periodization within the team as best we can, but fully knowing that, that individual, by not doing the work, they put themselves in a position where they're not going to contribute to the team, and in the end, it may affect their role.
Okay.
And I think, one of the things to consider is obviously, I think this is a frustration of every coach. So many times, it's one of the guys that, it's one of our best freaking players.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so now, like the conversation I have with the coaches a lot of times is, they're like, he's got to play 90 minutes.
Yeah.
If you play him 90 minutes, you're going to have him for a month.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're going to have him for 3 weeks. And so, why don't we, I try and say, well, why don't we flip it a little bit? You play him the last 15 or 20 minutes of the game when everybody else is fatigued, where he can be more impactful, because now he's going to be more, everybody's getting tired. Now he's going to be a bigger difference maker than him starting off. And then can we build him throughout the season? You go from 15 to 30 and so forth, and build him into the game environment. Build them from late in the game towards early in the game, so they can be a bigger contributor. But it is so frustrating. In the end, you can only do so many things.
Exactly.
But one of the gains, by doing this is essentially, if you think about it, one of the gains is the fact that the players reporting this. We can look at it. Obviously the soccer coach can't look at it. But with you're giving them strength program, for instance, we're giving them fitness components and so forth, and we can look at it to look and see, are they being not just compliant, but it allows us to change maybe the prescription, change the modify the prescription that we're giving them. If they aren't doing it, then we can talk to the player and guide them. Obviously, that's working outside of what the coach is doing, but obviously, that's the aspect that's NCAA compliant. Is the fact we can still talk to the player in terms of fitness elements, while we're not necessarily holding them purely accountable, which is unfortunate, because ultimately, by not allowing us to really do this, we're increasing the risk for our players to be injured.
Exactly. I think that's a big point.
It's not just a little bit of a problem; it's a big problem.
Exactly. No, I agree 100%, and that's the toughest sport or part of this whole training, especially with a sport like soccer, where there's seasons line up where we can't do as much as we need to do in the most important time. So it's crazy to me.
Yeah, and it's a big ask of the coach. You know, when you think about the 10 days, the 2 weeks you have for preseason, not just we obviously the physical piece is absolutely huge. Yeah. Right. But then to ask the coach to develop a complete methodology, a style of play. Yeah. For sometimes anywhere from a couple of new players to a dozen. Mm-hmm. It's really impossible. Yeah. Nobody can be educated that quickly.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. So we kind of talked a lot about off season, right? So how does your off season or your in season training in terms of conditioning, weights, that kind of stuff differ from your off season?
It's a big ask because it all comes down to managing the week or managing the windows between the games, because ultimately those games get closer and closer together. The games are the stimulus. The games are the physical stimulus in terms of fitness. Mm-hmm. Obviously, what we have to do now is manage groups. So you have one group coming in after the game day that needs a recovery session. Yeah. You have the other guys that didn't play at all. They need a fitness session, right? And then now we can manage all the players in between, right? So same games-based approach, but now the kid that played, say, 30 minutes is only playing 50% of the games. Right, so they get kind of a balanced stimulus across time, and so group training is probably the biggest single piece that I think you make sure everybody's ready for when they do get their chance. Now, when you look at the weeks, I'll look at an entire season. They'll never see a fitness session. Yeah, we'll never do a fitness session that would put the players at 100% of the capacity, because that's the game environment only, because there's too many games. Now, depending on how far apart the games are, we'll go to 75% low day or 50% low day, and that just depends on the games, honestly. Yeah. And so it's really managing that day-to-day window. Okay. Managing recovery effectively. This is one of those environments where the body doesn't really have enough time to ever adapt fully to the stimulus we give them. So I think one of the things, I think a lot of times we think so much about recovery, and we should be thinking more about adaptation. But in this environment, there's no time for the body to completely adapt, so it is about recovery. The micromanaging is a big piece. It was a big piece to that puzzle, and then obviously monitoring the players. And then even we found that even adjusting the loads, like we have a lot of teams in the Ivy Leagues and so forth that we've worked with, and even when they hit midterms, adapting. It's funny because oddly enough, the coaches usually schedule less games at midterm, so the players have a little bit more time. And so in terms, I look at it so many times, I'm like, oh, this is great. We can actually fit a little bit of a stimulus in here. And I call the coach, just want to make sure, no, that's midterms. Keep it the same.
Exactly, right.
Because it's a stress. It's a stress. So I think that's kind of the management in terms of the field-based work. Now in terms of the strength-based piece, it's again, guys wake up, girls wake up, they have a finite amount of energy. Really important to use the energy smartly. But for me, a piece of energy has to go into the strength environment, because ultimately, if we're always in the soccer environment, we're always performing the same actions, we're always performing the same type of muscular activity, it's a problem. So we need to be, ideally in the weight room, right? But then obviously there's this balance between the time that it takes to get there. So I have some teams, for instance, where commitment to get from the field to the weight room to get it's extensive. And so in those environments, we talk a lot of times, well, let's take as much as we can to the field, right, to make sure that we're loading the body in a different way, loading the muscular differently, so more concentric actions, and so forth, so we can maintain some semblance of not just strength, but complement this overload in terms of soccer specific plyometric based actions that the players are taking up, so that we can stay strong, but then also injury resistant. So the environment, the strength environment, is hugely important. But honestly, it's such a challenge to do sometimes. I agree. It has to be integrated. And for me, it's I talk a lot of times. You look at the week, we got 4 days between. Well, let's squeeze it in this day and then this day, and almost use the phrase of microdosing. Do it. Much rather have more frequent. Days in the weight room where the load's substantially lower, but they're experiencing it, and we can get a higher quality with no residual, but they're going to get it more frequently, because that's going to have the staying power. No, that's good. Okay, and you kind of talked a little bit about recovery, right? So what kind of modalities do you recommend, if you recommend anything? I know there's pool sessions, there's rollings, that kind of stuff, but is there anything that you found to be more successful, especially with the population and the culture? Or pool.
Pool. Okay.
Yeah, pool's been the big one for me that I found to be most beneficial. I've had a lot of experiences doing, back from your Kansas City days. We did it pretty extensively, especially in preseason. Did quite a bit of pool work, but what I found, honestly, the best environment that I found we did it. When we were in Portland, we actually had a rehabilitation pool that we used.
Okay.
We used a local facility.
Yeah.
So the pool was mid-80s. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
It was bad. Right?
Yeah.
And so the guys would get in it, and obviously, one of the things we always, cold's better than warm and so forth. But one of the things I found was, one, the compliance of the players, the willingness of the players was so much higher. So
really?
The first day we went in, they're like, "Oh, this is okay. This is okay," right? And so. But then also what I found is it was so much easier to get mobility back into the muscles, back into the joints, that it really was kind of the ideal recovery modality in terms of mobility, flexibility work. And going in there, obviously we're not doing swimming. It's more of a basically really slow, steady, kind of progressive, dynamic build-up.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times we go from there 5 minutes down the road back to our training facility. Guys that needed treatment would get treatment. Guys that needed wanted additional ice baths and so forth could do that. Other guys would go straight home. And psychologically speaking, it's a totally different environment. We're not on the field. It's completely away from what our norm is. And I think that helped for the players. That's one of the big things that gets talked about a lot in the soccer environment in particular. Coaches like the day after the game, completely off. The players are away. They shouldn't be coming back to the training ground.
Yeah.
Fair enough, absolutely. But sometimes we need to get recovery.
Yeah.
Right? It's so important because the next game's right around the corner.
Yeah.
Or there's no question over the course of an MLS season, 10 months, if we ignored it entirely, the players are going to start to develop overuse patterns, and we're going to get injuries.
Exactly.
So it's really important to get rid of those. And so I found this was a really nice balance because it was such a different environment.
Yeah.
And so obviously the characteristics of the water are hugely important.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So obviously the weightlessness we experience, the offloading is a benefit. So that's in terms of recovery modalities, that's the biggest one.
Yeah.
One of the things I used to, and we have this up on the website at Fit for 90. But they had this recovery point system. So basically, I did it way back when I was, I think, in Kansas City. But basically, just theoretical importance of all the different things you could do, right? So sleep, nutrition, hydration, all these different elements, a kind of a timeline of what the players should do. And I just posted it in the locker room to kind of try and educate the players. And what I found is, all the players, like probably about 70% of the locker room asked me questions about, especially the recovery tights, because the guys all love the recovery tights.
Yeah, that's the easy part, right? Yeah.
Like, why you give the recovery tights only 2 points?
Yeah.
Sleep's 10, you know? And so explain to them, it's this and it's this, and and so I do think, going back to kind of leading the player, that education piece, these are your habits, and the way we have it on the website now, which I think is the best way, is, it's basically expressed as, daily habits, things you should do every day, and then things you need to do when there's a congested window of games. So when you have games that are quick back to back, these are the things you add, but then every day you should be doing these things.
Okay.
And I found that really, for a coach, it allows them to look at and prioritize what they can do logistically, because a lot of times, we think we got to do everything.
Yeah.
And there's just not time.
No, most
there's
definitely.
Just time.
Yeah.
And then obviously, it's good on both ends as player, educating both the player and the coach.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, right? So we've been talking basically going along a logical periodization. So we want off season, right? So now we're talking a little bit more towards season. So how does that kind of prep, or how do you kind of prefer to prep athletes in those 2 to 3 weeks before matches, right? Or in the example, we kind of just touched on it, where you have an accelerated match schedule. So say we have like 3 matches in 5 days. What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on how much of a build-up time we've had. So obviously, one of the biggest challenges I have with the teams that we work with is if we have teams that come in early, and they've actually built themselves over the summer training, I'm confident going into preseason. When I have somebody, for instance, and it comes in 5 days before preseason, or I've even had a team, I had actually Duke, when they got to the national championship with the women. Yeah. The night before preseason started, they decided they wanted to do it.
Okay.
And so, so we literally in the
scrambling,
office, they're 15 minutes up the road.
Yeah.
We planned out the session, and then we planned out the periodization.
Okay.
But really, it's we can't change the players and ramp them up. If we ramp them up too quickly, we're going to get injuries. Like I can't force. It's like trying to get you to drink too much water.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I just can't force fitness upon you. I'm going to cause a problem.
Most definitely.
And so, regardless of that, we have to adjust our trajectory. Now, when we come into the hope is that we've had an ample amount of build-up time where we come into those 3 games in 5 days. The players are physically ready. They're physically capable. They have the fitness level to deal with that demand.
Yeah.
Right. Because one of the things we know is obviously players get fitter. They do more actions. They do more work in the game. More high intensity running, more sprinting. Usually a little bit more distance covered, but the high intensity sprinting is meaningful stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Now, those players also recover more quickly. Right. So if we come into that environment, we have players that aren't fit. They're going to be asked to do more work than they're capable of.
Yeah. First
game they survive. Second game they barely survive. Third game we're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so if we don't have that density of fitness, kind of that, if you go into the acute chronic, if we don't have that chronic loading, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's going to be now an acute spike.
Exactly.
And so if we haven't developed that, there's just a natural risk to it. Right? And so a lot of times, I'll talk when we have a high density, weekend, so tournament play or whatever. We have to taper into that weekend. So looking at the 4 or 5 days in advance, we really need to make sure the players are at peak readiness going in there because it's too late to build fitness. So if we haven't built it in the weeks out, when we enter that, I think we don't need to talk 7 days, but I think 5 days out, that should really be where our last fitness stimulus is.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And then if it's 4 days out that we're training, I've reduced it to 75% load, right? To just make sure that entering that first game, players are really, really flying in at peak readiness. We haven't built up the chronic load, so now it's kind of we want to taper in and you're crossing your fingers and you're hoping for the best.
Yeah, and that's such an accelerated taper too. So exactly, it's really just knock on wood kind of thing. So
yeah,
I agree. Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? And so I mean, if I'm kind of going off of like pregame and stuff like that, so there's 2 different camps in as far as warming up, right? So a lot of people like to do the same routine to keep the athlete in their sync, keep them in the same mentality, right? But then there's some that like to switch up their warm-up routine, whether that's in terms of like general warm-up activation or like the soccer-specific skills, right? But that is also, there's a component of unpredictability within the game, right? So what's your take on this?
Well, I think you hit on the biggest piece is the game's unpredictable.
Yeah.
And so just in terms of our warm-up, the idea is to take the players from rest to game intensity in this environment, the game intensity or training intensity, but to take them to the intensity of the actions, the environment they're going to be in.
Yeah.
So for me, we can really kind of divide up into physical intensity and cognitive intensity. So we need to progress both.
Yeah.
And so obviously you go from a known environment to an environment that's reactive, so reactionary, so sensory stimulus, whatever, but relatively simple decision.
Yeah.
And they go into the complex decision-making environment. And so we have to build all those up in tandem during the warm-up. So really important. It's kind of moving away from the warm-up. I think it's more preparative training, so to speak, because I'm trying to, when we talk about the warm-up, especially when I talk to soccer coaches, it's viewed as a precursor to training or a precursor to the game. And in reality, if we can make it a part of training, it's obviously never going to be part of the game, but part of training. Yeah. Now it becomes a useful piece of the day. So can I start to build that in? So going back to your question on the game, though, right? I think going obviously from simple to complex, slow to fast, like those classic pieces. But then when we go into, is it always the same? Well, the players are entering the game at different states. Yeah. And so we plan a Friday and we plan a Sunday. The warm-up should be different on the Sunday. Yeah. Right? Because the players, we had it was Sunday, Friday, Sunday, or what have you. They need a different warm-up on the Friday than they need on the Sunday, and vice versa. So those warm-ups should be different. And so obviously, physically, they need something different. They need maybe a slower, more steady build-up, but they also have a little bit more residual fatigue. So to be cautious with the progression and the energy we use on the Sunday, because we don't want to lose their capacity for the game. So those warm-ups have to be different. Now, in terms of kind of the dynamic and having fluctuation in terms of what we do, I found that having a core kind of progression in terms of doing something in a known environment where I know what my action is going to be and performing it faster and increasing that speed of play, and then going into where now it's a subtle decision, and then going into where it's a truly complex decision-making environment. As long as those kind of progressions are being met, the exercises, if the exercises change, I think that's going to increase the player's engagement.
Right? I agree.
and I do think it's helpful. One thing I'm not a fan of is coming into that environment, for instance, and introducing a new exercise. Right? So obviously we want to do something they've done in training that's somewhat wheelhouse, so they're not uncomfortable with it. But obviously having 3 or 4 different exercises and changing them and so forth. So, hey, we're going to do this one today, and we're doing this one because it's performed over a longer distance, and the acceleration is going to be slightly lower and more progressive, and that's our reason, because we want to manage the energy this way. So it's kind of linking all the pieces together. But always doing the same.
It's monotonous.
It's monotonous. Absolutely. I mean, it's probably one of the biggest challenges in a long season is how can I come up with so many different things, to fill this window of time. And the more, for me, one of the challenges is always how can I link it to what the coach is going to do as closely as possible.
No, I agree.
And that's really what keeps me fresh and kind of makes me come up with new ideas, because otherwise, like if you're not linking it, you're like, whoa.
No, I agree.
You run out of ideas.
I agree. 100%. And that's, kind of going off that same point, the players, they can only do the same thing so many times in terms of the dynamic piece. You know what I mean? Like, they're going to start either doing it with less quality and not getting what you want out of it. So to change that varying stimulus and just keep the cognitive input there, you know what I mean, to where they're like, oh, I'm engaged, I'm locked in, this is kind of a novelty. I don't see why we're not doing that for a lot of people. So.
Oh, you got to keep it fresh. And a lot of, it's funny because going in the youth environment, a lot of coaches you go and you watch and like, oh, the kids run the warm-up themselves. Because you watch them do it, they're not doing it well. And especially the kids when they're growing, we know they've increased injury risk. This is a really important piece for not just injury resistance, but also they're just development. It's a great environment to increase just a movement awareness, motor control.
No, I agree.
And we're not taking advantage of it.
No, I definitely agree. So moving forward a little bit, right? Kind of on that topic of injury risk, right? So I know with Fit for 90 technology and software, that injury risk is severely decreased. But what happens when we say have someone that comes in already with a pre-existing injury, or invariably if something traumatic happens? Like, how do we kind of handle that, and how do we kind of have like red flags or stages so we can kind of use preventative protocols?
So obviously, building that player back into the environment, so a player that's entering the season, so your freshman comes in and they have a pre-existing injury, how do we build them in the environment? So obviously, we have to build them in slowly and steadily. Slowly, we have to build them in steadily. I shouldn't say slowly, because it's always related to their fitness level. Do they have an existing problem? So, for instance, the testing battery would be kind of the first step. So, obviously, we won't have a proactive measure, that was pre-injury. But then the ability to compare non-injured to injured limbs is going to be helpful for that player. So, do we have, kind of where are they? And then basically making decisions off of that. So that freshman coming in, if it's a fitness day, and they've been injured, maybe it makes sense for them to only do 50%, and then they're either on the bicycle, on the treadmill, maybe running intervals on the side in a controlled, safe environment, as opposed to putting them in the decision-making dynamic environment where they're really going to experience fatigue, but then also be exposed to an injury risk because of slower decision-making, slower neuromechanical response times. And so the idea, of course, is developing a methodical way to build that player up over time at a safe loading, essentially, right? And then obviously taking advantage of the different environments and modalities that we can use to build the player up. When I was at UNCG, this was actually one of the more fun things I did. I taught a class. They had me develop a class called Optimizing Performance. It was an ATEP class, an athletic training education program for grad students. And basically that's what it was. It was managing basically performance during return to play. So kind of bridging the gap for the athletic trainer back to performance. And I'm actually currently teaching it at High Point.
Okay. Awesome.
It's a fun little class. It's really focused now. I've developed out through my experiences, really developed out kind of the method. To count not just for the testing, but the fitness, strength training, like everything we should be doing, and trying to really pull it together in a nice little method where you can address all the different pieces, all the different inputs that come in. Take advantage of all the different modalities to both manage an injury. So you have a long term residual from an injury with an old player. How do you manage them?
No, definitely.
So a guy that's minimal participation in training the last month of the season, but you need him every game. How are you managing his fitness level? So we, for instance, we took advantage of a local PT had an Alter G. So we used that thing nonstop for one of our players.
As much as you can.
Really allowed us. Yeah, the guy's playing 90 minutes, and but he's participating maybe 50% of our training session.
Yeah.
And he's still getting 70 to 90 minutes depending on how the results going, and staying healthy. And so I think, I mean, it's probably one of the biggest challenges. But also I think when the coach, one of the things I found when there's a methodical, when you're really systematically periodizing the team, it's now doable to periodize that individual coming back in any environment. Readiness, return to play. Yeah. You can really more tightly couple that player's needs to what the team's doing. And massively reduce the injury risk, the re-injury risk, I should say. Yeah.
No, I like that. Okay.
When you have chaos.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
definitely.
It's tough to bring a system to chaos.
It really is. It really is. There's so many moving parts that it's like, it's just hard to grasp some of them sometimes. So
it's a best guess, know, and we wonder why players get re-injured at a high rate, and it really starts with the methodology overall for the team.
Yeah. No, I'm with that. Okay. So kind of moving forward on this injury prevention kind of thread. So we know that playing on turf field kind of with cleats will increase risk of injuries, whether it's because of the immediate stops, that kind of stuff, or feet getting stuck in the ground with the cleats, right? And we also know that wearing cleats is going to kind of bunch up our feet and take away some sensory perception from that foot, right? So do you see any value in barefoot training, such as in like track and field may do? Or if so, how would that be implemented?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think given the nature of soccer in terms of cutting, turning, twisting, barefoot training is always going to be somewhat difficult.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think it's, if we were to do it, if we were to implement it, I would think it would be a nice dynamic on a recovery day, for instance. Nice day playing soccer, tennis. The guys are out of their boots, so they're not doing it. It'd be a nice change, in terms of dynamics and so forth. But I think in terms of actually implementing it in that game environment, in a training environment, I think it becomes difficult. To do and then actually perform at a high level. Yeah. One of the things to consider is exactly as you said. There is this acute piece to the turf because of the natural kind of grabbiness of it, the mechanics of it are different. But then also, most of the surfaces, you're getting a little bit greater ground reaction force over time as well.
Yeah.
So when you look at, if you're a team and you're training on turf every single training day of the year, right? We should probably be accounting for that in our periodization.
Yeah.
Right. So for instance, do we reduce the load? Do we go from a fitness day bring down to a 75% day? That may make sense because you are getting higher ground reaction forces, and in turn causing a little bit greater muscular response. If we think of it that way, right? Think about you're getting a greater muscular response. Well, let's reduce the load.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe a better way to look at it in terms of chronic, right? But absolutely on the acute, I think it's really important to consider if I'm going away and we're always on grass, but now we're going to be on turf. It'd be really nice to get a little adaptation so the players are used to it. Yeah. Right. And then obviously optimizing that cleat to turf interface. Are we using the right boots? Right? Are we making the right selection of boots? And that's something you obviously lean on the technology of the companies. And hopefully, I think there's been a lot of good movement in that direction to develop out shoes that are less grabby. Okay. Because that's obviously a big piece to that puzzle.
Factor. Yeah. Okay. No, I like that. So kind of moving forward, right, out of that training piece into your personal development. So what are some resources that have had a big impact on you, whether it's like a book, a podcast, a conversation with a coach or a lecturer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big things in terms of my own development. One thing I think, if I look back, one of the things for me is always trying to know as much as I can about the body. Yeah. Right? If I know as much as I can about the body really responds now to things in a really logical way. Right. So if I understand the body well, if I understand the physiology of the body well, the neuromechanics, I'm going to understand, and I always have to understand the stimulus really well. Like now I can connect these dots effectively, and this is essentially one of the things that I learned from kind of walking, as we talked about, going from the classroom to the field. Yeah. Right. In terms of my own kind of experiences, obviously, my formal education has been a huge one. Yeah. A long time ago, educating myself abroad. I think pursuing an education in different areas was really important for me. Yeah. But in terms of books, there isn't really a single thing that I lean on. I probably read more research than I do books per se. Okay. And that's probably, I can't think of a book off the top of my head that's really my go-to that I go to.
Okay.
So sorry about that. I can't give you a great recommendation of books.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's all about you just kind of learning about how you develop. So I think that's great. You talked about formal education, research articles. I think a lot of people don't really look at research articles, or the ones that are informal education don't take it seriously because that's not necessarily where they want to be, right?
But I think it makes sense though, because I understand one of the things about research, the research is typically behind what we're doing in the practical environment.
100%, yeah.
And so research isn't necessarily going to inform us about the decision we make in the practical environment, but if we can take the research and the high quality research and really allow us to understand and then apply that to the practical environment, really, now I think for me, we can start to accelerate the practical environment beyond where it is now.
Yeah.
And so I understand, I've talked to a lot of people about this, where research is, well, yeah, absolutely. And there's research. I read some research articles and I get frustrated. Because the interpretation of their data set is unreal to the practical environment.
It's very skewed,
So, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges of research. And that was a frustration for me when I went back to do my PhD, was really, everything. You're building your methodology, your research, I should say, off of previous research. You can't make any jumps. So you can't skip this step because this is logical. You have to actually have the research that says, and that's why it's such a slow moving industry. Or a slow moving world. So it's more about, for me, the research is more about me understanding something in more detail, and that's the bottom.
No, I like that. I think that's a really good answer, right? And then kind of moving forward into this last segment, just some short answer questions. So the first question, if you have any, what are some quotes or mantras that you live by?
Oh man, that's tough. It's tough. I mean, it's funny because I probably give you a different answer a year ago. I have a kid that just turned a year a little bit ago. And so my world's kind of flipped. So to speak. In terms of what not what I think is important. But for sure I think just kind of you are what you live by. You know what I mean? Like how you act. I've never thought of it as being more important than I do now. So I think I look back on all the different people I've been exposed to. I'm trying to think of the different quotes and so forth that have helped me out. And I can't come up with anything off the top of my head. I mean, the biggest thing is, when I worked for Gansler in Kansas City, he always had this saying, and I've used this one before. I stole it from him, but coaching is just, it's essentially teaching in short pants. And for me, that's what we are. We're educators. If you can educate the players, when you can get somebody to understand the why, then obviously their buy-in's going to go up. Their investment's going to go up.
If you understand the why, right? If you understand the why, you can endure any how, pretty much, right? So
absolutely.
Simple. I like that. Okay. So is there a thought or experience that has occurred in your past that you've held on to that has made a big difference in your life now?
Yeah, it's funny because it's a pessimistic one.
Okay.
But it kind of had one of the biggest catalysts for me was when I was actually at Tennessee. My second year, going into my second year there. My dad. It was after my second year. It was when I actually moved from Tennessee to Carolina. Actually, sorry about that.
No worries.
My dad passed away.
Okay.
And it was really a catalyst for me because my dad was a geochemist, so he was in science and stuff. But he was one of the leaders in the industry. He was really well respected, had his own business and so forth. And that was kind of like it's kind of the kick in the butt you needed. Like just kind of I need to do something special. It was really a moment for me where I was like, I want to be as good as I can be, and then hopefully at some point become somewhat of a leader in terms of my industry. And I think about that. It's funny, you think about it a decent amount still. It's been a long time. But I still, there's days where you think about him, and not so much that he's directly motivating me, but that kind of has become just ingrained. Like what can I do today to push smart? What can I do today to be better? No,
I really like that. Okay. So, what is the best advice you've ever been given?
I had one friend once, he just said to me, he's like, you got to hold yourself to the highest standard. So just, how high can you hold yourself up in terms of just how you act, how hard you work. how you interact with people.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest thing I took that for, is like, how am I going to interact with people? Because ultimately, I think, especially where we are currently, there's nobody's. I don't look at myself as being any better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I think
we're
that's
all human.
treat everybody with respect. Because everybody has a hell of a lot of value.
I agree. Awesome. Okay. So in contrast to that, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
So my sister has given me the worst advice in the history of man, right?
Okay.
Cave on the small things, but hold on the big things.
Okay.
And something's relatively small and meaningless, like, it's okay to just agree it away, even though you disagree.
Yeah.
What I found is, it's horrible advice, because in the end, if you give away, like, that's okay.
Yeah, the small things make the big thing, right? Yeah.
Small things make the big things.
Yeah.
I like this advice.
Yeah. That's really counter basically opposite of what coaching is, right? We coach all the small things, so basically don't be a coach. Yeah.
It's not because if you apply it to the coaching environment, you've eroded your entire culture.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's funny.
So this was personal relationship.
Yeah,
but
most
definitely. I'm like, it was mind blowing.
Yeah. That's
hopefully
funny.
She doesn't listen to the podcast.
Okay. Yeah. We'll keep that one quiet. So, okay. So what is one of the biggest struggles? I think you kind of alluded to it, with your father's passing. But aside from that, what is one of the biggest struggles that you've had to overcome? Like a personal.
It's funny because sorry, go ahead.
Like an interpersonal within yourself, if you had.
Yeah, I was married before.
Okay.
I was like 27, 28. I was married before, and that was probably the biggest thing. Got a divorce.
Yeah.
That was probably the single biggest struggle.
Okay.
That I dealt with. And,
Yeah.
And interestingly, like when you tandem, I came out of that.
Yeah.
And then my dad passed away about a year later.
Oh wow.
When
Okay.
you see the two of them, where I started to realize about that point in time, really, that I was in a bad relationship, and I was actually independent. Not so much that I was, this like I can do anything I want moment, where it was related to freedom, but it was related more like I can free to push myself now.
Yeah.
Because I was being held back, and then obviously the catalyst of my father. Like those two things together were probably the biggest thing.
Yeah.
And so that's from a personal perspective.
Okay.
That's probably the biggest challenge I've had, and in hindsight, it's obviously it actually is not that big of a challenge relative to what other people are experiencing.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting moment, because when you add the two together, I think it's probably been a big difference maker for me.
Yeah, that's really tough.
Positively.
Okay. And then the final question here. So what projects are you currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
Yeah, so from a company perspective, Fit for 90, we're about to launch, hopefully in the next month and a half, an individual product.
Okay.
So obviously we have a team-based monitoring system. We work a lot with teams, but now we're developing out an individual application where the player will basically be able to monitor themselves.
Okay.
But then also they'll get back an injury resistance program.
Okay.
So essentially day-to-day, kind of a very fluid, similar to what I talked about earlier, but a really fluid approach to training and making sure that the player's staying injury-free. So foam roller, mobility work, corrective strength, and so forth. Kind of bridge the gap from essentially the player getting out of the car or in the locker room to coming out of the training environment. Really fitting their needs in a dynamic way, because obviously they're reporting their site soreness to us, they're reporting all this information. We can really hone in on what that individual needs. So that's a big thing that I'm working on right now. We're closing in on actually getting that done. So developed all the video, kind of doing all the cues and coaching points and all that. So that's from a Fit for 90 perspective. That's the product I'm working on. And then been working pretty extensively on just a couple different projects in terms of a book on dynamic mobility and flexibility, so preparative training essentially. And also more of a holistic method. That's a longer term project that I've been working on quite a bit.
Okay. Fantastic. And then last thing is, how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey, ask you questions, that kind of thing?
Yeah, Fit for 90 is the website, FITFOR 90, and then email's great, jcone@fit490, and then I'm on Twitter, although I don't jump on it as much as I used to.
Okay.
That's at JR Cone, CONE.
Okay.
But yeah, any questions? Like I'd love to talk about this. I'm pretty much happy to share as much information as I can, and then building out a lot of coaching education for Fit for 90 as well to hopefully move the market in terms of educating our coaches. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Coach, this has been awesome. I really enjoyed the conversation, a lot of knowledge, and just that, being able to kind of dive into something other than sport as well. You know what I mean? So I really enjoyed that, and I appreciate your time, and hopefully we can connect again soon in the future.
That's awesome. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for joining me, and if you enjoyed the podcast, please head on over to iTunes and give me a 5-star rating, as well as write me a review if you feel so led. Next week we'll have another exciting guest. So until then, this is the Gamut of Performance Podcast.